box.
Okay.
They're already dead.
We're into saving the paper, or at least the trees.
Regrow the trees? Wait.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our April meeting of the Delaware Valley Chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I am Janice Rail. I am the president of the chapter of DVAU. We've been around since 2003. We do many different activities in the Delaware Valley area. We fight against church-state legislation that may run afoul of Pennsylvania's or New Jersey state's constitution, such as in 2005 we fought against an intelligent design bill. And just last week in New Jersey, I testified against school vouchers and a proposal in the New Jersey fiscal budget for 2016. So we try to stay abreast of all the issues. We also have meetings like this where we have speakers come and talk about different issues. This is our first time that a member of our Clergy Advisory Board has spoken to the chapter, and this is the first time that we have discussed the issue of minority religion. So I'm very excited that you guys have come out to hear this issue tonight. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jennifer Booker, who is from the DVAU Clergy Advisory Board. She'll be talking about the view from the wild side, minority religions and separation of church and state. Dr. Booker's talk will focus on nature religions, which are not faith-based and are outside of the mainstream Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. What makes nature religions different philosophically and in practice, and how does that affect separation of church and state issues? What guidance is the religious right using to judge nature religions? Raised in various Protestant and Baptist denominations, Dr. Booker has been a practicing Wiccan for 30 years, including training in several Wiccan traditions, the Church of All Worlds, and exposure to Egyptian, Erisian, and Druidic practices. She has earned 3 engineering degrees and teaches computing for Drexel University. And now may I present Dr. Jennifer Booker. Yes, you're on.
Make sure we get the hand.
Hi, is this good? Okay. Hi there. Welcome. I'm trying to present this kind of unheard viewpoint from the minority religions because the vast majority of people I've encountered in Americans United tend to be humanist, atheists, somewhere in that spectrum. And there are very few that happen to have the pagan perspective that I do. And so that's what I'm trying to do is explain a little bit of the background and the differences between my point of view and what traditional Judeo-Christian religions tend to believe, and how that affects the separation of church and state issues. So starting at the ridiculously highest level, in the handouts over there for those that just came in, obviously people can be broken into the very broad categories of theist, believing in some sort of deity, atheist, there is no deity, agnostic, I'm really not quite sure. Can we come back to this question later? And then within theists, we can go to monotheists or polytheists. So most of the major religions pretend that they are monotheistic, but they also implicitly recognize the fact that there are other gods. They just say, don't worship those, just worship the one that we told you to, you know, our pet volcano god. So for example, from Exodus 23, you shall have no other gods before me, from the first commandment, blatantly says, well, there are other gods, just don't worship them. In contrast, nature religions, which I'll use as a generic term for the minority religions I'm most familiar with, generally embrace polytheism. They generally recognize divinity as having both male and female aspects, not just male. And gods might have all genders. They might, but they also allow for monotheism as a possibility. So, for example, there's a tradition of Wicca known as the Dianic tradition, and that explicitly says we're going to worship the goddess and nobody else because that's what we really need at this point in our lives. And that's perfectly fine within nature religions to say, you know, this is what I need at the moment. That's absolutely wonderful. I realize there's other stuff going on, but that's okay. This produces a huge church and state issue because most of the time when anybody's talking about religious issues, they automatically assume that they're talking about the one male God, and they ignore the fact that there are all these other perspectives. For example, the Egyptian religions, like you saw for Isis and Osiris and all these ancient deities, recognize something on the order of 3,000 different deities, depending on whose counting you look at. So the way that you can break down the origin of these different perspectives and religions, particularly in the minority world, in contrast with the religions that we see most of the time, the ones that are basically dogmatic. They say, well, somebody who is either divine or very close to it wrote down some incredibly sacred document or philosophy, such as Mohammed or Jesus or Moses. And they generally produce a viewpoint, particularly from the Christian point of view, that says there is exactly one correct interpretation of deity. And then they tend to invoke things like faith in order to justify that, well, this point of view that we have is the correct singular view that is possible and allowed, and anything else means you're evil and you're part of the bad guy. In contrast, most nature religions tend to be experiential. They recognize that everyone's experience with divine power can be very, very different from one person to the next, and everyone's viewpoint is correct. And so this plurality of beliefs is completely foreign to most of the people that try to establish policy at the state level. A lot of nature religions are based on tribal beliefs and practices. So you'll see, for example, there are recreations to the extent possible of Druids from Ireland. Naturally, there are still some native Aborigines in Australia, Native Americans from various parts of North America and other parts of the Americas. There are some more obscure ones. Odinism and Asatru are basically Norse traditions that some people follow. The original Egyptian religion is based on the Church of the is the basis for the Church of the Eternal Source, as they call it. And Wicca, or witchcraft, is based on the English or British traditions. And so you get a lot of characteristics that came from very primitive people, and their religions became, grew out of them naturally. Similar to that, you also get a lot of people that are practicing various forms of native healing. So the people that were the herbalists, the medicine men, the shamans, and the midwives were very, very powerful and very highly respected in their communities. And when the new order came around for predominantly Christian-based religions, they said, well, that's giving them too much power, particularly when they saw that a lot of the people that had power were women. And they said, oh, we can't have that, especially midwives. So they said, no, you can't handle this anymore. We have to give this to a bunch of male doctors instead. And so they took the power away by claiming that what they were doing was fundamentally wrong. Amusingly, some forms of nature religions also come out of science fiction. I was a member of the Church of All Worlds, which is based on the book Stranger in a Strange Land. A couple of you nod and go, yes, I remember that one. Occasionally I'll use a signature of V.M. Smith for the main character's name, Valentine Michael Smith. And so that was based on a novel by Robert Heinlein, in which Valentine Michael Smith was raised on Mars and then came to the Earth and had a very different perspective. You could also argue that Scientology and Mormonism might have traces of science fiction in them, but they would probably get very upset if you said that. So I wouldn't say such a thing. And some nature religions are also based entirely on satire, because they refuse to take themselves too seriously. And so in the late 70s, somebody decided that the perfect satire would be to create a religion based on worshiping the Greek goddess of chaos, Eris, also known as discord or discordia. And so Discordianism or Erisian philosophy was born. There's a book you can still buy if you look around for it, How I Found the Goddess and What I Did to Her When I Found Her. Excellent title. Includes such serious things as a genuine Pope card to remind people that you're the authority of your own religious beliefs, if you have any, and therefore you are the Pope as far as your own beliefs are concerned. Also in the not terribly serious category, what started as some very, very flamboyant dances on Fire Island by a bunch of gay men started the fairy tradition. Things like tea dances, which involved them dressing up in some of the most outlandish ways imaginable, at least in terms of what little clothing they did have on. And so it was a sense of, this is so important that we have to reconnect with the silly, the wild, the crazy, the absurd. And so it's well welcome within the world of paganism and nature religions that's also honor too. Because as we well know, many other conventional religions take themselves extremely seriously. So most nature religions tend to recognize that they have at least some foundation, except for the bizarre science fiction ones, in pre-Christian times. So when Christians try to say that, well, you're just worshiping the devil, it's like, we existed before the devil. What are you talking about? we couldn't care less about the devil. That's just Christianity upside down. We're not either one of those. And therefore they're not faith-based because they're based on experiential religion. There's no central authority, just like the Pope card I just mentioned. And most of them don't proselytize. They say, well, if you want this kind of path, you will find it. And so they don't go out handing out leaflets or advertising or putting up billboards. But this also weakens them a great deal politically, because a lot of the people that practice nature religions are solitary practitioners. They don't have big churches, they don't have big amounts of money, they don't coordinate their political actions with each other to any great extent. They might have a lot of shared values, but they don't do anything that makes them strong politically. And that gives them a very weak position as far as separation issues are concerned, because they may have very strongly held beliefs, but there's no organized system to allow them to communicate with each other. There's no central authority document like the Bible. There are some inspirational texts here and there, but there is no central authority because it's based on what you experience with the divine. But correspondingly then there's no dogma, there's no concept of guilt or sin or all those other things that tend to weigh down an awful lot of people with conventional religion. The concept of good and evil is replaced largely with karma. It's like if you do horrible things, it'll catch up to you. Whether it's next week or 5 years from now or sometime, it'll catch up to you, and that's part of the obvious motivation to do good stuff. And most nature religions tend to associate objects in nature with qualities or even gods. So the sun is often associated with the god, whereas the moon is often associated with the goddess. And typically women are associated with the goddess simply because menstrual cycles are 28 days typically, and that's the same cycle as the moon. Okay, maybe there's a connection there. Biology, gotta love it. And also we have elemental concepts like earth, air, fire, water. Those are also used as inspirational concepts for being very active or very passive or thoughtful or emotional. So there are lots of corollaries, and you can map them to things like Myers-Briggs types if you really felt like it. So the basic attitude towards the world can be very polarized. Most traditional religions that you see, for Christianity in particular, say that nature is bad. Isaiah 66:1, I had to look it up, was the line about the earth is my footstool. So it's treating the earth as, oh, it's just something inconsequential I use for resting my feet. It's no big deal. Whereas in most nature religions, they regard nature as being fundamentally divine. So there's a subtle distinction that most people won't try to get into too much of, is nature itself divine, or is the divine hard to separate from nature but also exists outside of nature? And that's a little bit of a tricky question to get into. That's a little bit too esoteric. Closely related to that is the idea of animism, which is the belief that things that are traditionally, according to science, not regarded as being alive, may still have energy and powers associated with them. So this is where a lot of the stuff associated with things like healing crystals come from. There's associations like that. My favorite example would be to say if I took a rock and I put it on this podium and said, okay, first of all, prove that I'm alive. And you could say, well, you know, I've got a pulse and I'm breathing and there's oxygen being exchanged and all this good stuff. It's easy to prove I'm alive because you know those things to look for. And you know what time scale to look for. If you check to see if I'm breathing and you do it for 5 minutes and I'm not breathing, there's probably something wrong. But if I put a rock up here and said, okay, is that rock alive? Okay. If it were alive, what would you measure? Would you know what to measure? How long would you have to measure it to determine that the rock was alive? And so you could get into some very interesting arguments based on, well, the lifespan of a rock could be enormous compared to anything that we experience as human beings. So there are a lot of philosophical issues that cross over with the sciences in there. Also related to the nature is divine concept comes the idea from James Lovelock in a book that he wrote back in '79 called the Gaia Hypothesis. And that was postulating, based on his very, very scientific analysis of the way that the Earth had been changing over a very long time period, that he was proposing that the Earth herself was alive and actively maintaining an environment in which people could live and creatures could live. And therefore, there's sort of the ultimate extreme of recognizing that not only does everything around you have life associated with it, but even the Earth herself. So it's a very, very different perspective than you see from the mainstream Christian religions, in that it is embracing nature quite literally and otherwise. One of the few relatively sacred texts associated with Wicca is called The Charge of the Goddess. And one of the lines in it attributed to the goddess is, "All acts of love and pleasure are my rituals." And from this you get some really strong implications, such as social and ritual nudity are perfectly acceptable in most nature religions, which runs into some real major legal issues because most of our legal issues are based on the fact that, well, you know, the body is fundamentally obscene, and therefore, you know, you can't show a breast on Facebook, and otherwise the universe will end. Well, I'm sorry, you can't show a female breast on Facebook. And you go through all these bizarre arguments about how much the body is regarded as being unclean and fundamentally unfit for being seen. And in contrast, the Wiccan approach says, no, your body is completely divine, and what you do with it is sacred. Nature religions also tend to embrace all forms of gender identity as well as sexual preference. So you'll find an unusually high proportion of people from the LGBT communities there, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. Simply because everything is acceptable as long as it's, you know, between or among consenting adults. And this also leads into conflict with marriage laws, because many nature religions recognize that, well, as long as you know, it is consensual, there's nothing wrong with having a relationship or a marriage among 3 people or 4 people or 5 people or whatever you feel like, as long as it's being done in an appropriate way, that you're not, you know, manipulating people. So polyamory and polygamy are very often viewed as being acceptable, whereas we're getting all the traditional, no, marriage is between a man and a woman. Right. So you saw all the little memes going around on Facebook about that. It's like, well, let's see. If we look at, what was it, King Solomon had 700 concubines, Or if your brother dies, then you have to marry his wife in order to keep the family intact. And yeah, those are some also traditional forms of marriage endorsed in the Bible. Wonderful. So there are lots of conflicts with basic assumptions about the body and relationships and what is accepted. Some other church and state issues that come up a lot with pagans and nature religions. Sometimes the fact that you are practicing one of them can be used as a basis for discrimination in hiring, or it can be used as a basis to fire you because somebody says, no, you're a witch. And that also gets drawn into child custody battles, where somebody will say, well, obviously she's an unfit parent because she's a witch. It's like, oh, okay. So they're making huge assumptions about what the inherent goodness of somebody's religious path is based on those characteristics. There are also marriage issues. Fortunately, being here in Pennsylvania, we have extremely liberal laws about who can perform a marriage because we have these wonderful Amish that are not really terribly formal about their education for their clergy. And therefore, essentially, you can become clergy simply by being recognized by your peer group as being clergy. And you don't have to have, diplomas hanging on the wall and all this other stuff to be qualified to perform weddings. So there are lots of issues that cross over with relationships and work related to what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do. And so the media also feeds into this image of what do we regard these nature religions as. I mean, the huge push from the Christian side is to say that, well, anything that is not Christian is satanic. Because if you're not on our side, by definition, you must be against us. And so, like I said, most nature religions are pre-Christian in origin, so it's kind of absurd to say that, well, yeah, the devil was invented in about the 14th or 15th century. Maybe the 16th at the latest, I believe. And so that concept just doesn't work. So most people view magic as, well, I'm going to turn you into a newt. You see all these, silly shows on TV, Sabrina the Witch and whatnot, and they're trying to portray all these magical powers. To be fair, the Church of All Worlds was all based on having all sorts of very interesting powers in addition to speaking Martian, being able to levitate things and have them follow you and stuff like that. And so, yes, of course we can't do that. Nobody that I know of can do that, at least. But that's part of the image of what it's about. So it's trying to add a sense of, we need to be afraid of these people because they have these weird powers. Or we have to be afraid of these people because they're crazy enough to think that they might develop these kinds of powers. So it's using the concept of, you're not one of us, therefore you must be, evil, as part of that concept. Likewise, Halloween, of course, we see all the interviews with local witches and local covens and stuff like that. The reason that there's that association is because Halloween is when what is said to be the veil between the living and the dead is the thinnest, and therefore it is easiest to communicate with past ancestors, and that's why you have all the associations with ghosts and stuff like that. So, how do the religious right, view nature religions? Well, generally, and I speak from having been a member of many Christian organizations, including things like some of the college-based organizations for Christian groups, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, there's the name. They simply say that, well, if you're not Christian, they lump you into this generic category of pagan. So that anything that is an Eastern religion, a nature religion, an atheist, an agnostic, anything else just gets lumped into this big horrible blob, and it's like, well, it's all bad because if you're not following our path, you must be doing something wrong. And that means that you are implicitly evil and untrustworthy and everything else, gullible, all those kinds of things. Also, as far as their official doctrine was concerned, we can go all the way back to 1486 for the Malleus Maleficarum. That's as close as I get to pronouncing Latin. which was they called the Hammer of the Witches, and that's where they described in completely gruesome detail how you are supposed to torture people to get them to confess that they are witches. And this was done in the name of Christianity. Very scary. One of the quotes from that I put in this handout: "To disbelieve in witchcraft is the greatest of all heresies." And so it's interesting when you see Christians saying that there's no such thing as a witch. It's like, well, you might want to consider your own doctrine on that. And the most famous quote, of course, surrounding witches is from Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." And witch originally in that context was a word that meant something like truce breaker or somebody who was dishonest, and had no such specific connotation as somebody who practiced witchcraft. But it got twisted and mutilated over the years to allow people to take it and say, oh, well, this must be what they meant by it. And that's sort of convenient interpretation for 1611 when they put together the King James Bible. And they said, oh, well, since we're getting ready to prosecute witches, I guess that must be what they mean there. So there are a lot of fundamental differences between minority religions and the dominant Judeo-Christian paradigm. I pretty much leave out Islam a lot because I don't know that much about it. I don't have that much experience with it. And I only hinted a little bit at the Eastern religion perspective, which is also minority religion in the United States, but has some other perspectives. Some of the big references, one of the best overall summaries of understanding nature religions was originally published in about 79 by Margot Adler, Drawing Down the Moon. It's been updated a couple of times since then, most recently 2006. And specifically on Wicca, one of the earliest and strongest influences was a book called The Spiral Dance by Starhawk, who is a Northern California witch who has gotten quite famous from her publications. She's more from the extreme radical feminist side of witchcraft, which is not too surprising a stretch. So you get a lot of elements of people that are close to environmental movements in nature religions, because you're trying to protect something that's sacred, not to mention things that you need for survival. You get crossover with people that want to use drugs for experimenting, to try different perspectives on seeing the world. Some places like the Church of All Worlds get relatively heavily involved in marijuana or acid, and use that as a tool for psychic exploration. It works for that, but it's not exactly the best way to get there. And some of them kind of burn their brains out a bit from doing that too much. And so the view of many minority religions, at least in the nature religions, is very fundamentally at odds with almost every single aspect of the dominant Christian and Judeo-Christian religions that we see around us, from the perspectives on nudity, to perspectives on relationships, to the concepts of needing to experience the divine rather than having somebody tell you, oh, this is what this means, and this is what you're supposed to do, and put your money in the offering plate every Sunday, or else you'll go to hell. And so it's a wildly different viewpoint, and most people just get the image of it of, oh, it's October, it's time to hear about the witches again for a 30-second soundbite on the news. Yeah, basically part of the reason that the church and state issues get squashed over the minority religions so much is because it's mostly a bunch of peaceful hippies. And while they have some radical political views, a lot of them don't have the coordination among them to be able to make anything happen out of it. And so there's an awful lot of pressure to engage in protest or support forms of legislation, but it's very piecemeal. And the lack of unity and the amount of solitary practitioners make it very, very hard to gather a lot of momentum from minority religions. So that was just as much as I prepared. The little handout, I think though you didn't get one yet when you just came in. So I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions if we'd like to get some more discussion going on this. Yes?
Do you know of any efforts made locally in Pennsylvania to kind of squash out the practices of minority religions? Like, have there been any attacks on your practices, on your faith, on your traditions?
I think the question was, for those that couldn't hear that, was whether there have been any attacks on minority religions in our area recently. None that I know of, but a lot of them are very quiet. A lot of it is, well, you just got let go, or you didn't get the job because, or somebody brings it up in child custody proceedings, and so it's behind closed doors for the most part. So there hasn't been anything really overt that I've heard of for a while. I think that's partly because there hasn't been a really broad movement in that direction for a while. It's one of those things that where you get some people that get drawn to it briefly, like when they're in college or something. It's kind of like, the years of college experimenting. And they say, oh, this is interesting, I'll try this, and maybe it'll really tick off my parents if I do this. Okay.
So the discrimination is more of like at an individual level?
So it's much more so the discrimination is much more at an individual level rather than wholesale, because it's very, very hard to find who is actively involved in pagan religions. Naturally, there can be places like if you have occult bookstores or feminist bookstores, you'll often find a lot of books on neo-pagan religions there. And that might be a point of contact for trying to find somebody that's involved in one. And there are student groups, like Drexel has one, and I'm pretty sure that Penn has one as well, for example. So there are student groups for people in that age category that are interested in it. But beyond that, you get a lot of people that try it for a little bit and go, no, that wasn't right for me, and they move on to something else.
Yeah, to the point you're making now, one high-profile case that comes to mind, the West Memphis 3, wasn't the guy who was convicted in that but eventually let go, he got out a couple years ago, he was kind of scapegoated, and they said he was Wiccan, I believe, or pagan, or practiced that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that story, so I'm not...
It's accurate.
Yeah, so, there is a common trend to basically still cry witch. And say, oh, well, of course they have no credibility, they're a witch. And that's really sad.
Yeah, my question was, I happen to be a pantheist, a scientific pantheist, so I agree with nature being the greater power, but just don't assign anything what we consider supernatural to it. But one of the things I've always thought is kind of a sweet irony is that pagan symbolism is seen as secular, and I sometimes point out to my Christian friends, you can't have the manger in that public school, but they put a tree up, and they consider it secular. That is pagan symbolism. That means something to pagans. Now, maybe not the plastic one, because they worshipped it outside and left it living in the ground. They can chop it down and bring it into the building, but I know that pagans are very individual, as are Wiccans, and like you said, it's more about your individual spirit. But do you ever get any feeling about that how pagan symbolism is considered secular, but actually allows it to stay alive in the very places where overtly Christian symbolism gets kicked out?
Oh yeah, so there is a tremendous amount of pagan symbolism, because one of the great strategies that the Christian church, and particularly the Catholic Church, had was that whenever they went to take over a place, they would find out who the local deities were and make them into saints. So you have, for example, Saint Bridget. Well, Bridget's a goddess from northern England. So they would say, oh, you want to worship Bridget? Well, come to our church. We have Saint Bridget, and there's an altar to her over there in the corner, and you can come to our church and worship her. And a lot of the early churches in Europe were built on top of the pagan sacred sites. So it'd be roughly the same as putting a cathedral on top of Stonehenge. And so they adopted not only the deities, but also they took over a lot of the symbolism. I have a book at home that says, well, there have been 16 crucified saviors that weren't Jesus. that followed the same kind of story, and there's a tremendous number of parallels in different mythologies about exactly the same sort of mystical foundation, miraculous birth, virgin birth, etc., and being sacrificed and coming back from the dead. Well, most pagans believe in reincarnation, so coming back from the dead is not exactly a fantastic trick. From my limited spiritual experience, I think that the human spirit is far, far, far stronger than simply our bodies. And therefore, I find it easy to believe that our spirit probably goes someplace else after we die and could easily come back as something else. I don't go the whole, Buddhist route of trying to get to nirvana. I think you can have nirvana on earth if you play it right. But yeah, so the things like the Yule log is very, very blatantly, that was used for divination. I think it was, after you cut down the tree, you wrap the Yule log in something like pig entrails and you roll it down a hill, and then you do scrying, you do divination based on what happened to the pig entrails as they were unwrapping from the log. Yeah, they did some pretty bizarre stuff.
But Christians have actually kept pagan symbolism and icons alive better than any remaining legacy of paganism has.
Yeah, absolutely.
They just
Simply
don't-
by virtue of their numbers.
Right, but they act like it doesn't mean anything, but I'm always pointing out to them it means something to someone else, just not to you.
Oh yeah, we'll take for example that this is about to be Easter.
Right.
Now, could you please tell me what things maybe rabbits symbolize in spring?
Or eggs.
And why do they lay chicken eggs?
But I've known Christians who don't even know, they think that the Easter egg and the rabbit got added to the cross. They don't know it's the other way around, and they're surprised to learn that.
Oh yeah, and just like things like Santa Claus, it's like, what exactly does the North Pole and presents have to do with the rebirth of the sun? S-O-N, S-U-N.
I happen to have been raised Catholic, so tonight's Holy Thursday.
Oh.
And I thought there might have been traffic from the cathedral for their big thing. But the whole cycle now of dying and being reborn, doesn't it relate back to paganism and the belief a lot of the bodies that didn't survive through the winter would end up being cut up and used for fertilizer in the spring, and that was the rebirth, seeing them come back as flowers or plants. At least that's the way I understand some of the history and origin of the whole death and rebirth cycle in the spring.
Oh yeah, there have been other much more gruesome versions of the death and rebirth cycle. One of the traditions from, I believe in Ireland, was that in the spring they would choose one of the young men of the community to be the sacrifice for that year, and his girlfriend or wife or whatever role she had would slit his wrists and ankles, and he would dance around in the fields to fertilize them as he was dying. But it makes perfect sense from a biology point of view that if you add a whole bunch of blood to your soil, you fertilize the daylights out of it. Yeah, and so you can get into some really bizarre concepts of, well, what would it be like to be the person that was chosen to be the sacrifice, and B, what was it like from the girlfriend's or the wife's point of view of, you need to execute your husband now in order to help the community stay alive. So you can get a lot of really, really gruesome traditions that are very, very toned down in what we see today.
Pig blood work as well.
Yeah, probably. They may not have had many pigs, I don't know.
Fertilizers out there that are composed of blood products. I used to run garden centers.
Yeah, there is blood in a lot of fertilizer, so it's not even a far stretch to realize that, yeah, there's a lot
Well,
of
they're
really,
really
really...
not that strange, any different than crucifying God's only son.
Right.
You know, I mean, what's strange, you know?
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah. What other questions do we have? Anybody?
No, I was going to chime in on some of the other points, so I'm good. Because what I was going to say about your point is most Christians today
are unaware of their history and how they came to be and where their symbols came from. So if you look at Easter and the eggs and the bunnies, they don't understand why there's eggs and bunnies there. They don't understand about the Christmas tree. They don't understand the whole idea of having bread at Lammas, which means loaf mass, which is at the end of the summer to celebrate the first harvest. They've disconnected themselves from their actual nature roots and have no concept about these things.
And that's part of
We weren't
it.
taught a lot of that in school either. It's just like, you're a Catholic and you're Catholic.
Right, the pagan rituals are kind of imposed on you with no reasoning
Right,
behind them,
Or,
and you just do it.
Candlemas is the equivalent of Bridget, also known as Imbolc, which is a time when the lambs are being born and milk is running, Imbolc. And it's pronounced Imbolc, and it's spelled I-M-B-O-L-C.
Yeah,
So-
it's fascinating. You can find calendars that compare the solstices and equinoxes and the cross-quarter days to the major holidays of Christian and even Judeo traditions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it
And
actually,
of course, we also, related to Candlemas, we also have the famous groundhog. And which is used for divination to tell how long winter is going to last.
Well, even the
Which
date
is
for
the-
Easter Sunday is pagan. It's the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Right. I tell them it wouldn't move around. He only sacrificed himself this one weekend. You would just say every sixth Sunday or whatever of the year becomes, but it moves around.
Or like Christmas, it was this particular day, that's our story. And of course, even the date for Christmas itself is wrong because the shepherds watching their flocks at night happened in the spring. It didn't happen in the middle of winter.
They don't know when he was born.
Yeah, so assuming he did exist, which is fairly likely, yeah, there's no way he was
They
born
don't know
December
when he was
25th.
born, but they picked the time that they know for a fact he wasn't to celebrate.
Mhm.
But my understanding was at the time, there were too many celebrations going on, because pagans would party like every other week over something, and you can't get any work done.
It's a dirty
So
job,
the
but somebody
idea
has to
was
do it.
Just put them all together.
and at the time, Christianity was illegal. It was easier to hide your festivals within somebody else's festival to do something like that.
And the 21st was when the 25th was when the equinox happened under the old calendar.
The solstice.
Right,
Yeah,
and
solstice,
it's related to
yeah.
Mithras and the
Yes.
same mythology. And likewise, within Wicca, sometimes they regard one half of the year, there's the Holly King is in charge, and the other half of the year, the Oak King is in charge. And the transition just so happens to be at December 21st, at the solstice. And so that was convenient timing for, oh, it's the rebirth of the king. Oh, which king were you talking about now? So we just sat right on top of, they just sat right down on top of all the old traditions and just said, we're just going to change the spelling a little bit here. Make it a lot easier to take over this time period.
Wow.
I was the idea of the war on Christmas. I think, well, do you have that because you launched a war on all the pagan holidays that you took over, and now you're afraid we're taking them back?
Mhm.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing. Because, for example, when I was growing up, we had, for history classes in grade school, we had 11 years of American history and 1 year of world history for everything else that ever existed. Including, I remember one lecture in which we said, they said, well, we're going to cover 200,000 years of history today. So they went through the Stone Age and the Bronze Age and all these other ages. But there's also a tremendous amount that happened here when the white people came to the Americas and brought all these fascinating diseases and alcohol and all sorts of stuff that the natives here had never seen before. In addition to actively trying to wipe out some of them, particularly in Central America and Mexico and so on, there was a tremendous push to say, I guess there were two different approaches I just heard. One of them was that we were just going to intermarry with them and make them disappear. That was more the Spanish perspective. And the British perspective was more, we're just going to kill them all because they're all just worthless heathens and it's okay if we destroy them because God told us so. So, yeah, more things have been done in the name of God told me so than, yeah, it's frightening. Any other questions or comments or?
I read this book called The Changing One, so I'm transgender, so
Mhm.
I look female, but I identify as male. So I was looking into Native American mythology to see like if there are any gods, and I came up. There was this one book called The Changing Ones, where like there's 150 different tribes in the United States.
Oh, easily more than that. Yeah.
Recognized, like. Females who look like males and males who look like females and females who look like females and all this. And the Navajo had this god called Bego, who evidently was a transgender god. So I was just wondering, do you know anything about the Native American religions of the Lenni Lenape? I remember, like, I went to a transgender conference here in Philadelphia before, and there was going to be a chief of the Lenni Lenape who was going to talk about transgenderism, like in cultures around here, but I couldn't get. I was from the outer burbs, so I couldn't get down in time.
Oh, okay.
But I was just wondering, have you heard, like, do you know anything about the religions of Lenni Lenape, Native Americans?
Not the local ones, no. There was just an excellent speaker last fall at Drexel. I believe he's from Canada, from the western part of Canada, and he spent most of his career now trying to map out what are called two-spirit, as a generic term. All the people that don't fit into male or female, they have a little bit of both in them, or a lot of both, or something like that, and therefore they fit into what we now call transgender. He was mapping out what originally started to be North America and has now expanded to the rest of the world to try to find some authoritative sources to say what were the concepts around people who were not binary gendered, and what did they call them, how did they treat them, did they have certain roles within their tribes. And so he's found, everything from Aborigines to Eskimos to you name it, they're all over the place. And he presented this enormous spreadsheet that he's been working on. Part of the problem is that a huge number of people that were trying to identify these were the white men that were coming in to first understand these tribes, and therefore they weren't let in where any of the women were, and in many cases they weren't let in where any of the transgender people were. And so they had a very, very biased perspective that they first gave on what these people were, and they often gave them very rude, inappropriate names and stuff like that. So I know there's some amazing research at that larger level, but it'd be very interesting to see what's going on what's going on locally and where it's come from.
I read an article recently where they said 3% of the population is transgender, which sounds really, really small, but if you ever multiply 3% by 7 billion, it's a large amount. I was quite amazed at that number.
Oh yeah, Philadelphia has 1.5 million people in Philadelphia County. And so 3% of that,
Yeah,
what's that, 45,000 people or some ridiculous number? Yeah, that's a very, very large number.
I tried it on the calculator, there wasn't enough zeros.
Also one of the areas that I was involved in recently, I was with an organization that unfortunately just had to disband, but a lot of the young adults who are homeless, a tremendous number of them are from the LGBT community, in large part because they either aged out of the foster care system or they came out to their parents and their parents disowned them. And so something like 30 or 40% of all the young adult homeless people are gay or trans or both or something else in that spectrum. And so there's this huge problem which is finally being recognized. It's called Foyer of Philadelphia, was trying to address that. And we set up a winter shelter for a couple of years and tried to provide a place to at least give them some safe space. Because if they go to a conventional shelter, do you go to the men's area or the women's area? In one of them you'll get screamed at, in one of them you'll get beat up. It's not really a good choice. And so there were some huge issues around that. And they're just now being addressed. There's a version of Foyer in Chelsea, up in New York, and they've been very successful, but it's a huge struggle like any other nonprofit, to keep enough funding to keep the place going. Just because it's very, very expensive, and it's such a specialized area that it's not like you're raising money for cancer research or something and people say, oh sure, we'll give money for that. And it's like you say you want to, give money to help homeless, gay young men in Philadelphia. They go, huh? It's harder to get funding for things like that. But that's also another crossover area.
I think it was Mother Jones, they just had an article about a program they have in Utah that has drastically reduced the number of homeless. It works very, very well, and most people don't realize that. Utah has a program that, if you're looking for information on something that should come across the country, it's one of the recent months of Mother Jones, I'm not sure which. Could be the Progressive, one of the two.
Yeah, some of the success stories I've seen recently around the homeless were simply saying that some places said it was a ridiculous amount cheaper to build some little tiny homes to give to them.
They just gave them a room, no matter what their problem is.
No wonder
they
what
gave
their
them a
reason
room.
is, just like here's
And
a,
it's way cheaper.
50 square foot room, and call that your home, and okay, now focus on getting your life together. And that's part of what Foyer was trying to do, was to figure out how to help them get GED or job training of some kind, or some
Housing
other,
first, I think.
take care of the basic needs of food and shelter and all that good stuff, provide them with counseling, therapists. So we got people with from Temple that helped out with that. But yeah, it's an enormous problem, and people are just now waking up to that dimension too.
Anyone else? Well, let's give Jennifer a big round of applause. Well, thank you very much. I thought that was excellent, and I think we all learned a lot. I certainly did. In the past, Americans United for Separation of Church and State has represented Wiccans and people of natural religions in cases such as, I believe, getting headstone markers in military burials and cemeteries, because those used to not be options. And I can't remember what year it was. I want to say 2007, I think, is when Americans United won a case and got, finally got the United States government to allow pagan symbols to be used on the headstones of pagans and Wiccans who had died in combat, and used those in the military cemeteries for the first time. So, I have a couple of announcements before I let you guys go. We have a meeting coming up in this very same room next month, Thursday, May 7th. That will be on the subject of death with dignity. It will be a multimedia presentation with Barbara Mancini, who is a nurse who is charged with killing her father by giving him an overdose of drugs. He did not actually die of an overdose of drugs. He died of pneumonia. It was a very long and drawn-out case, and Barbara will go into great detail with it. We'll have it all set up really nice in here, so with big screen and everything. So I have handouts over in the back in the corner of the room. But before that meeting, the Saturday before that meeting, on May 2nd, we have our big biannual event. DVAU is hosting a conference called Reclaiming Religious Freedom from the Radical Right. And if you have watched the news at all in the past couple weeks, I'm sure you have heard the words religious freedom coming up. And people are saying religious freedom and we want to discriminate against gays in the same sentence. And they're trying to pass bills that they're calling religious freedom bills, but they really want to just discriminate against gays and call it religious freedom. And we're going to have a whole conference all about that. On Saturday, May 2nd, that will be at the Philadelphia Downtown Marriott at 12th and Market from 12 noon to 6 p.m. There will be a coffee break midway through with some snacks, or you can have lunch on your own. The Reading Terminal Market is right nearby, and I also have information on that in the corner of the room. If you're not already on DVAU's mailing list, you can sign up for that. We have sign-up sheets right over there. And also, your membership in Americans United makes meetings like this possible. So please consider joining Americans United. If you are a member, you get a subscription to Church and State magazine. And we cover all areas. We are the only magazine that covers just church and state separation, but it covers many broad issues such as women's rights, LGBT rights, prayer in schools, fighting school vouchers, which is my big thing right now, especially since I just testified last week against school vouchers. I'm so happy about that. So.
He's got money for vouchers, but not to pay the pensions.
Oh yeah, and yeah, wonder about that. You wonder about that. They slipped that $2 million line item right in the New Jersey budget, but there's no pension money. So, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out to the meeting tonight. It's been nice to see you all. Thank you.